Woodland Wanderer sew along. Today we'll be sewing up the Waves and Wilds Woodland Wanderer pattern. I'll just give it a couple of moments for people to join now that we started the live video. So my Woodland Wanderer will be a soft shell outer, and I'm doing a French terry inner because I'm doing mine for age 1, which is quite small. And if you use too thick of fabrics, it's not very easy to move in. They walk around a bit like penguins wearing it. So I'm trying to keep the fabric nice and flexible and movable. So hopefully we've got some people with us now. If not, we'll just wait another couple of minutes. I've only just started the video. So for those of you joining, hello. We'll be doing the Woodland Wanderer sew along tonight. I'm using the new set cell design because it's awesome and I love it. I've made myself a outer already. So this is what we'll be sewing up in the first part of the sew along, and then you'll also need an inner. I've printed myself up some matching stripes, and these are my bits ready to go. So these are the bits I'll be demoing on tonight. I'm only going to be using a standard sewing machine because I've already overlocked my inner together. So it will just be the sewing machine tonight. It's very noisy, my machine, so you'll be able to hear when I'm sewing anyway. Okay, so if we're ready to get started, let's get going. Let me grab my first pieces. So as you can see, I've already partially constructed this, just for the ease and speed of the sew along. So what we're going to aim to do in the next few steps is add another front panel in, then we'll set a sleeve in, and I've added on mine a little bit of extra top stitching here. This is just to hold the soft shell down because it's an age 1, and I wanted it to be nice and comfy really. So to start off with, we're going to add on another front panel. So make sure your back piece is facing upwards and you can see the right side of it. Then you need to make sure you're taking the corresponding front piece. Now I find the easiest way to do this is to lay the front piece on top of the back piece and ensure you've got 2 necklines and 2 arm sides. If you don't have these 2 matching up, you've probably put it on the wrong side, in which case it's going to look funny in a minute when you turn it. So we're just going to simply clip these together, and the Waves and Wilds Woodland Wanderer pattern uses 3/8 of an inch for its seam allowance, so we're going to ensure we use that seam allowance throughout. Okay, so we've clipped our shoulder seam. I don't tend to use many clips because it's not a very big piece. We're going to slot that under. This is my 3/8 of an inch line here on my machine, so making sure that we've lined that up and that we're just at the start there. Just going to make sure we start nice and close to the edge of that soft shell. Now my machine's a bit noisy, so excuse it. A couple of stitches, I'm going to reverse that, and then we're going to go all the way to the end. There we are. That's a nice, easy, quick bit. So then we're going to snip our ends off because we want to top stitch this shoulder down. I mean, this isn't essential, but it makes it look nice and professional. So you're going to go to the right hand side, and then you're going to make sure that your extra bit of your seam here is turned under the back piece. So it's pushed towards the back. And then, in order to get nice neat top stitching, I always use my open toe foot. For those of you that have seen my tip-top top stitching video, you'll know that I love this foot. So we're just going to put the foot down and line our seam edge up with the edge of the foot. There you go. So now if you sew with it, keeping that seam nicely lined up with the edge of that foot. Now normally you would iron this seam out, but you can't iron soft shell, so just try and press it out with your fingers as you go. Keep that seam nicely lined up. Just going to end that. Now when you take this out from under your machine, you're going to have a really nice, neat and tidy bit of top stitching there, because by pushing it against the edge of the foot, you've kept it nice and even for the whole seam. So I always do my top stitching. If I want my top stitching to be further from the edge, I just move my needle over a bit. Okay. There you have it. That's your shoulder piece done. So you'll repeat that on the other side, ensuring that you've got the right front pieces on. We know they're correct because they'll hang down at the front and they will overlap quite significantly. That's because the Woodland Wanderer has an overlap at the front. It'll look a bit like that. So now we're going to add our sleeve in. Open it up nicely so that you can see which part's the arm side and which bit's the neckline. You don't want to accidentally sew a sleeve into a neckline. Softshell doesn't like it if you sew it and unpick it. I haven't marked the notches on mine, so I'm just going to approximately find the centre and then I'll adjust it as I clip. So that's the approximate centre. I'm going to lay it over the neckline, covering it, and then I'm just going to line it up with my shoulder seam, and then I'm going to clip the end on over here. Now softshell's a little bit trickier to set your sleeves in just because it's a slightly stiffer fabric. It is woven, it's also got some lamination on it to make it water resistant, so it's not quite as floppy and stretchy as the French terry. There we go. So now we're just going to gently ease around these edges here. It is tricky because they bend in different directions, and sleeves are always a little bit tricky to set in, especially the softshell. It's lovely to sew with though, and they make brilliant little coats. Just make sure you've got the edges nicely lined up. Now mine might be slightly out when I get to the top because I just approximated that centre point because I forgot to cut my notches in. So we're just going to let the extra out, and as long as everything matches up, by the time I get to the clip at the other end, we'll be alright. Pinning, I find, or clipping, I wouldn't use pins with softshell because once you make a hole in it, that's it. You can sometimes very, very gently iron a hole back out again, but it's best just not to make any additional holes in softshell. It's not very forgiving for holes. Right, so we're almost all the way around now, and that's your sleeve set in. Shift that up a bit. There we go. So this is now clipped on, and all we're going to do, again using our 3/8 of an inch seam, is go around this edge here, and that will sew our sleeve on. So let's load her up. Make sure it behaves. Holding stuff together with your fingers a lot when you're sewing a softshell. It is quite slippery sometimes. So I'm just going to pop it under there and then adjust as necessary. There we are. Now, a lot of people try and keep their fabric flat all the time when they're sewing arm size, but as long as the bit that's going under the needle and the foot is flat, don't worry about the rest. It's almost impossible. So we are just going to make sure that what's going under that foot is flat and staying lined up. This is the trickiest bit I find with the softshell, especially on the sides this small. They're being gifted to some little ones, so they need to be tiny little ones. So I can feel here that there is a slight bump, so I'm just going to push it out until it gets past the edge of my needle. And then I know that I'm not going to sew in any tucked pleats or anything like that into my fabric. You need about 10 hands to do this bit. There you go. When you get to your shoulder seam, just make sure the rest of your fabric there is still pointing in the right direction the way you sewed it. You don't want to create a big lump in there. Go around the corner. This is by far the slowest section. There we go. Okay, so we're almost round now. Okay, so we're almost at the end. Sorry, I was concentrating really hard there. I forgot that I was meant to talk. So let's get round the rest of this. Ah, there we go. We've got round the hard bit. It all gets easier now. I find that so much easier on the slightly bigger sizes. So we're just going to go round the corner. I'm going to come off the end. Don't know if it doesn't quite line up. Mine's a little bit off there, but that'll be okay. There we go. So now we've got our arm set in. So this bit isn't essential, but because I've done it on the other sleeve, I would need to do it on this one. So to do my top stitching for the arm, all I've done is fold my seam allowance down so it's running in the same direction as the sleeve, and then using the same technique as before, I've just top stitched all the way around there, and the result, as you can see on this sleeve, is a nice smooth outer edge, and on the inside that's all just held down nicely. It's not going to bother the little one. They're only tiny, the ones getting this. So once you put the sleeve in, you're then going to need to sew your sides up. So I'm going to use the sleeve I've already top stitched, and we are going to align our armpit seam first, making sure that we get it nice and even. This just helps have that beautiful finish when you've got a perfectly matching seam, because we all strive for them perfect seam matchings. And then we're going to line up the ends, and we're going to clip along the sleeve, and then we're going to clip down the side of the body. And this will give you a closed edge. Now you can see that I've cut my back piece with the extra little flap at the back, so it drops down lower. So what I'm doing is I'm lining this corners up. I don't need to worry about this extra bit hanging below, because that will actually be sewn onto the lining, so it doesn't matter that that bit doesn't match up. We're only interested in the bottom corner points. There we go. Okay, so using your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm actually going to sew up the side and down the sleeve, because then I'm sewing and pushing that seam in the same direction that it's already laying. So it stops me from having to try and get over that seam and potentially pushing it back again and creating a lump in the seam. So it also means I get to start on a nice straight edge. So load it into your machine at the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance again. My foot is escaping, so I'll just put my foot pedal back again. There we go. So we're just going to sew straight down it, nice straight line, trying to keep our distance from the edge nice and even. Once I've loaded it up, I tend to just watch this bit and make sure it stays the same distance, rather than constantly try and check the guide underneath. And I find a good way to measure this edge piece is if you go until you hit the original seam. So we're just going to keep going. When you hit that original seam, when you pivot it, it will be more or less correct coming down the second seam. So now we're going to go straight down this edge. Flattening it that way. That's the bulk that we don't want. Then when we get to the end, again, just a couple of reverse stitches, and then we can trim that off. There we go. So we've got one side and one sleeve seam. Cut your threads as you go along, which is something I really need to remember when I'm not doing sew alongs, because there's threads all over the garments I make. Now if we turn the sleeve, there you have it. A lovely little sleeve, and then you've got the side seam. So that will be repeated on the second side, and you'll end up with something like that, minus the hood. So, the Woodland Wanderer hood. Let's put this to one side and we'll grab the hood pieces. Again, I have cheated. I have made half of it already, just for the ease of speed tonight. And I've got my second half ready to go. So we are going to make sure that we are attaching our centre strip on the curved edge. Otherwise, we'll be sewing the front shut. So curved edge goes along the strip. So find the back of the curve and put it at the bottom of your hood there. And then you're going to very carefully line this up. Again, you're trying to align a curve with a straight seam. So just take it slowly, plenty of clips. I'm going to very carefully clip all that together. Right. Now we're going to keep going around here. We are almost there. This is why I thought I'd do half of it in advance, because otherwise you spend your entire sew along watching me put clips on garments. These videos will be published to the YouTube channel when I've finished, so you can go back to them, pause them, and do the second sides of the garments, and then unpause them and carry on. So I'm going to continue going all the way down here. I'm going to make sure I line these points up at the end. There you go. So you've now put a straight line on a curved piece, and I find it easiest to sew it that way around, so I'm sewing down what would have been the straight edge on my centre piece there. Also, it's good before you sew it up to turn it and ensure, if you've got a directional print, that everything is up the right way. The worst thing is when you've sewn it really beautifully and you turn it up and like all the ducks are upside down, or seagulls as these are. So best to double check before you sew it shut. There we go. So I'm now going to sew down my centre strip. So let's load that up. Connect that on there. We're going to go forward, add a few of our reverse stitches in. And then we're going to very carefully try and keep that nice and even as we go round. Just gently curve it into the machine. I tend to sew with my fingers splayed across the fabric, and then if they get a bit too close to comfort the needle, but I can hold it all still. So it's going to keep going, trying to keep that nice and even. All the way around there. Slipped a little bit there, but... And if it does slip a little bit like that, it's not the end of the world. Especially if you're just making a personal garment. It's best to get the garment done, even if it's not 100% perfect. People are going to love it anyway. The amount of mistakes I've made on some of my garments and people still say, oh wow. Don't worry too much about making tiny little kerfuffles. I'll try and line that one up. When we get to the end of here, do a couple of our back stitches. And then we have a neck. Now, because I like to take a pattern and I like to sew it up, and then I like to make it a little bit more difficult for myself, I decided to top stitch any of the outer visible top stitching in blue. So I just need to quickly change my thread colours, because I decided, why not take something and make it that little bit harder for myself? Which, if you've been following my sew-alongs or my tutorials, you'll know that I do that quite often. I like to, you know, really mess around. So let's just quickly load a new bobbin in. And a new thread. You can see that I've spent many, many hours threading this machine. It's re-threaded an awful lot. So pull that bobbin thread up. There you are. Right, it's ready. So again, I'm going to use my tip-top top stitching technique. So I'm just going to finger press the seam towards the centre of the centre panel. I don't want it facing this outer piece, it should always be towards the inner piece. Just a quick hello to everyone who's watching. So I only see the comments when it comes nearer to me, the camera, so thank you for attending. It's really nice to see people here. So again, let's keep this seam lined up with the edge, the inner side of this open toe foot. And we're just going to run our seam down that. And you'll see that even on a curved seam, it's just like magic. Keeps your top stitching so neat and tidy. And now I absolutely love top stitching. If I can get away with adding extra top stitching to a garment, there is extra top stitching on my garment. And then just when you get to this bit, you'll feel it. It gets more difficult to do. Just push your hood upwards. And that allows you to really get in close to that curve around there. And you'll feel it start to tighten. And then once you've got round that curve, I pull it apart in order to keep the soft shell flat. You'll feel it loosen up again because you've got round the tight curve. Okay, keep pushing that seam towards your centre panel. And when you get to the end, there you have it. You'll have a nice, neat line of top stitching that follows your seam up and around that corner. You can see it there. So that's the technique I use on all my top stitching. Absolutely love it. So let's get rid of those seams, and we are going to attach our hood to our garment, which of course means, having only one sewing machine, I need to change my thread back to the yellow thread, because I like to do these kind of things to myself. But let's clip it on first. So you, at this point, should have 2 sewn sleeves, but I've only got 1 sleeve sewn up. It's probably going to make it harder for me later, but never mind. Turn that hood. So I'm going to use the edges of my centre strip, fold it in half, and that will give me the centre point of my hood. And then I'm going to take my back piece, and making sure I'm measuring the back neckline, not the arms, I'm going to fold it in half, line up my seams, then I'm going to find that. So I've got centre of my back, centre of my hood, and then I'm going to put them right sides together. I really probably shouldn't have turned that one to begin with. And those right sides together will mean that when the hood is up, the seam will be on the inside. Now, when you're clipping this on, it will not reach the end. You will be left with a little overhang over here on your body. That's to do with the closing section of the Woodland Wanderer. Because there's an overlap, you don't want the hood being in that overlap. So when you're clipping it on, you'll probably find that unlike most necklines, your hood won't reach the end of your neckline. And that is perfectly fine. So you can see that overlap there. That's where your buttons or your studs or your toggles, they're going to go down that centre strip there. So I'm now going to finish clipping the other side. And once you've done this, you will have a complete outer. Be it in French terry. I mean, you can make lightweight ones in cotton lycra. If you're going to make the inner in teddy fleece, I found it easier to use an overlocker for that, just because that stuff stretches all over the place. But it's also very fluffy, so be prepared to look like there's been an accident with a soft toy in your house once you finish cutting that up and overlocking it. I made that mistake making my son's one of these. There was fluff everywhere. Now, the best thing to do at this point is just check that you've got that even. So from that front of that hood to the front of the edge of the panel, you want them to be the same length. That means your hood's nice and central. And I always like to sew from the top of the hood because I can see where it starts and finishes. If you're overlocking it, which I will actually show you because I did it on my lining, I actually overlock over this first part. So I don't try and join it in, I just go from the end and go all the way across. So you can see the hood actually starts over here. So if you're overlocking, it's easier to go at the end, but because we are machine sewing this bit, I'm going to start at the edge of the hood itself, which is why I want my hood being the top piece. Just going to quickly change that back to yellow. But I'm going to have to change it back to blue once I've sewn it together, because I'm actually going to do my top stitching in blue. I should have just gone with yellow and made it easier for myself, but that would be no fun. Also, automatic needle threaders. They are the bee's knees. I just have to squint at the hole otherwise, and it takes me about 15 minutes to put the thread through. Whereas this, it's brilliant. There we go. Machine threaded. Okay, so we are now going to go from the edge of this hood all the way just across that hood, really, till we get to the other side. This soft shell's trying to bend over there. Do not let it win. You have to kind of bend it in the way. Need about 10 hands at this point. And then once it's under the foot, I messed that up. But anyway, once it's under there, I might also have a slight corner missing on that hood. That's because I gave myself 1 metre to cut 2 Woodland Wanderers out, and I've had to sacrifice a little bit of edges in the seam allowances in order to get my garment to fit on the piece of fabric. So now we're going to sew just straight across here. This is our back neckline where the hood attaches. You will feel lumps as you go across because you'll feel a shoulder seam. And then obviously you've got to go over the bit where you connected the centre panel. And then you'll also feel another 2 shoulder seams. Another shoulder seam. Not another 2. Too many shoulders then. We're just going to go right across there. We're going to keep going. Now, my sewing isn't always perfect, and I don't try to make it always 100% perfect. I just like sewing. So as long as I can make a nice looking garment at the end. And that's a seam, so I don't need to worry about that lump. And the hood's almost attached. Bend around there. Doesn't want to obey. There we go. Okay, so you'll now have a hood attached to your coat. and you'll see that all your outer nicely lines up. So at this point you'll have an entire outer. You need to make the lining in exactly the same way. Don't worry about deciding which way around it's going to go, whether it needs to be the inside or the outside or anything like that. Just make the lining in exactly the same way as you've made the outer, because figuring out how to connect it together is the next stage. So I'm going to put this to one side, and I'm going to take the one I've already made, conveniently in exactly the same size as the one I've just sewn. Just notice that I haven't trimmed some of the threads off, which is a common occurrence. So I'm just going to quickly trim that. Oh, I only missed one, that's not bad. Okay, so we are going to turn our whole garment inside out. There we go. Beautiful Woodland Wanderer. That's our outer. Now we are going to get our lining and make sure it's the right way around. And we're just going to shove the sleeves out the way. We're not actually going to sew the sleeves yet, but we are going to shove them out the way. Now, in the pattern, when you make the lining, it tells you to leave a gap in the lining, which is a turning hole, and then you'll hand sew it up later. I hate hand sewing, and I always forget to leave my turning hole. So, as normal, I've changed it slightly, and I'm going to do it ever so slightly differently, just so I can avoid hand sewing anything, and I also didn't leave a turning hole in my lining. So there you are. So now that we are right sides together, I like to start at the top here with the hood, because we know that the hood has a central strip, so it's quite an easy bit to line up. So quickly line that up. Now we want to follow this line down. We're going to find our next matching point, and we are going to make sure this seam sticks upwards, because then we can align this corner. And now this bit takes a lot of clips, because we are basically going to clip almost the entire garment together. So we're going to go round the hood here, and then we're going to go down the other side of the hood, and we are going to ensure that this seam is going upwards, matches up with this seam. Make sure they both point upwards. There we are. Now, I know I said I forget to leave a turning hole, but we are going to have a turning hole in this. It's just not going to be in the lining. I like to leave one of my bottom front edges open, because it's a straight edge, which makes it a lot easier to turn in and sew shut in a minute. My French Terrier stretched slightly more than my soft shell, so I'm just going to squish it in. Now we're going to line up these bottom edges. And this is going to be the bottom edge that I leave open. So I'm not going to worry about clipping that bottom. I'm just going to clip up this side. This is just something I learned when making my previous coats, is that I'm a terrible hand sewer. I hate doing it. It takes time. And I'm going to forget about it. So there you go. We've done that side, we've gone across the top, around here, and we've got another edge. And then, believe it or not, we almost have a complete coat at this stage. The only things we've got left to do are attach the lining and the outer together, and then we're just going to have to sew the sleeves. There is also an option to add pockets if you're doing the pocket version. Personally, I don't like the pockets on the Woodland Wanderer, or the positioning of them. I find them a bit odd. But that is personal preference, and I think it's a lovely coat. Also, I don't think a 1-year-old needs pockets, really. And I didn't have enough fabric to cut them anyway, because I honestly had scraps left. Now I'm going to ensure that both these seams point towards the back rather than the front pieces, so they're pointing towards that big handle across the back. And I am going to clip that up. I'm also hoping I'm not going to run out of bobbin thread, but I'm showing you how to sew this together. So we're going to play a bit of bobbin chicken. And now I'm going to sew this. So where I was saying earlier, don't worry about matching up the curve, that's because this lining curve should match this outer curve, and that will sew all that shut. You don't need to worry about that. And we're going to go all the way back to this seam, and then we're going to stop, and we are definitely 100% not going to forget about that, and we are going to leave this piece open. 100%, don't forget. I don't know why I find it easier to remember that than the gap in the lining. There you have it. You should go from this back piece all the way across the back, across one front piece, up the closure, across the top, around the hood, across the next top, down the closure, and then stop. However, we are going to start sewing slightly inside that just so we can do a corner, because it makes it neat. So I'm going to sew on my soft shell side. I'm going to load it under my machine. There's a lot of fabric and a lot of clips going on now. So I'm going to start about there-ish. As long as the hole that I leave is big enough to turn the coat round, then we'll be alright. Hey, I'm not the only one who hates hand sewing. I literally can't stand it. It's the bane of my life. I hate hand sewing. If I can get away with it, I won't do it. So we're going to try and guesstimate the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on this edge. So I tend to go to what I think might be right. Turn it. There we go. And just double check. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. I just guesstimate. Okay, now we're going to really start to see a coat come together here. So let's go all the way up here. I'm so excited about gifting this coat. It's probably one of the favourite coats I've made. I just think if you dress a child in bright colours, you can't lose them. And my children stand out like sore thumbs on the school run. You can see them from a mile off. Now that looks about right-ish. There we go. Okay, along this top, there's a lot of things to keep an eye on here. We don't want anything getting caught. So we need to stop 3/8 of an inch past this, so that when we go up and over the hood, we've got it. So, one more. I think that might be right. Let's have a look. Oh, no, not quite. Go back and add another stitch. So we're just gonna one more stitch along there. Try again. Yeah, that looks better. There we go. Now we're going up the hood. Almost to our centre panel now. We're going to cross over this centre panel. Try and hold your seams together nice and tight so you get the nice neat seam at the front. And you get that lovely professional look. I mean, if they don't stay lined up, they don't stay lined up, but give them a squash. Especially here. When you go into the second one, it likes to try and push it, so squish it out. I've got a little bit of a bulk forming here because my hood's trying to come inside my... Get it back inside the hood. My machine did not want to go through that. Let's try that again. This is where I worriedly check my bobbin thread and make sure I actually have... There's nothing worse than sewing for ages and then realising that you've been sewing with nothing. but air. My French terry hood is actually ever slightly too large. The French terry stretched a little bit, so I'm just going to try and ease it in there. Oh no, I just hadn't clipped it properly. Fair enough. Right, so again, hold your seams down to make sure they don't fold back on themselves, because you don't want to create a little lump here. And we know where our 3/8 of an inch is this time because we've already got it here. So we're just going to sew down to it. About right. Another stitch will be too far. And then we're going to go. This is the top of our closure again. That looks about rightish. Oh, lovely. And then we're going to go straight down our front edge. And then we just got across the bottom to do. There we go. Almost there. We are getting a little bit close here. Let's keep going. What's the worst that can happen? So we run out of thread and I'll have to do a bobbin. Gotta love a game of bobbin chicken. Right, now we're going to go across the bottom of our second front piece. And then make sure our seams are pointing towards our back piece. And let's get to the seam. We're going to get past the seam and nervously check our bobbin. Holding on in there. We might actually be okay. Mine's just got a gentle curve, so I'm just going to follow that curve around. Ooh. It's probably best not to look. I'll just keep going. The problem with soft shell, you don't want to make lots of holes in it. I said I wouldn't look, but now I can't help but look. Right, let's get to that seam. Because once we've got just past here, we're actually going to stop. Because remember, we must not sew that bottom edge up. Don't do it. Oh no, look, we had plenty left. Could have sewn another whole coat with that. Look at that. Right, clip your threads off. And then the big reveal. There's my other edge. The only thing with this, I've used soft shell and it is not as flexible as some fabrics. So I'm just going to find my edges here and I'm just going to give them a chop. This will reduce the bulk in my corners. I mean that I have a little bit less when I'm trying to turn. It just makes for a neater finish. Just don't snip through the seams you've just done, because otherwise you have to go back and do them again. And don't chop your fingers, because I've done that. You push on it really hard and chop your finger. So there we are. Done. Now when we turn this through that hole that we have definitely 100% left here, we will get a coat. Now when you're making bags, this is called birthing the bag, because sometimes it's so hard to get the bag through the hole. Yeah. So anyone who has had kids, that makes you wince slightly when you have to birth it. Now this looks a bit of a mess at the minute. It's just bits everywhere. Don't worry, just keep going. Have faith. Just keep pulling bits out. Eventually, everything will be somewhat somewhere. There we go. There's got to be a hood somewhere. There we go. So now we have this odd looking creation. Not quite a coat yet. So I am going to put my hand back inside the hole if I can find it. I'm going to just find each of my corners. When I found the corner, I'm just going to give it a shove with my finger. You can use a chopstick, or you can use, you know, the end of a pen that doesn't draw, and just shove those points out. Make sure you've opened up these bits. Keep going. Find the next one. That one's already fine. We're going to push this one out, and then we're going to come down to this last one. This is why we sewed a tiny bit on the beginning, just so that when we turn that corner it's neat. It's much easier to do it than try and make it look neat when we top stitch in a minute. It still looks a bit odd, but never fear. You're going to now get your lining side and put your arm in it. This is really hard on the tiny ones, I'm glad I haven't made it much smaller. And you're just going to push it through the sleeve. And then you're going to get your second lining sleeve. Put your arm in it and shove it down that sleeve. Again, chopsticks are useful for the little sizes. And now it's all starting to come together. All we're going to do now is just roll this seam between our fingers and make sure it's just pushed out all the way around as much as possible, because we're going to have to top stitch it. There's quite a lot of bulk in mine here, so I'm going to give it a good old squish. I mean, if you're using 2 French terry layers, French terry and a cotton lycra, or jersey as it's otherwise known, you can iron this out, but obviously I've chosen soft shell, so not so easy. Now we have this gap here because we left a hole. So all we're going to do is fold it to our 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we are going to clip it shut. Then when you top stitch, you just top stitch across this, and that means you'll have a nice neat finish without any hand sewing, and you'll never even be able to tell that you didn't follow the instructions and you went off piste. So we're just going to hide the fact that we didn't listen to the instructions, and just make sure them edges line up. And there you have it. You'd never even know. Now the next bit takes a while, so I'm probably not going to do it for so long because you guys have been here for almost an hour. So I'll just quickly explain what I would do. So all I'm going to do is roll my seam, making sure it's nice and tight, and I've pulled all the excess out, and then I'm going to clip it down. I'm going to do this for the entire outer edge of my garment. And then, using the same technique that I used before with the top stitching on the hood and around my shoulders, I'm going to put some blue thread in, because, you know, got to change that thread again, and I've almost run out of yellow bobbin. And you're going to follow this line of clips. So I like to start somewhere a little bit inconspicuous. So normally I would start like, I don't know, just before a seam down here. I don't like to start at the front because the focal point of the garment's going to be on the front. So if your top stitching doesn't quite line up when you get back to the end, you don't want it being visible on the front. And you're going to follow this line of stitches, and you're going to go up all the way around the hood, having pushed it in nicely, down the other side, across this edge, down the front, across the bottom, all the way around, back to where you started. And that will basically flatten this seam, make it look ever so lovely, and that will finish off your front pieces. But how to finish this, because you don't want to be wearing it like this. So all we're going to do is pull our sleeve out a little bit, and we are just going to fold it to our seam allowance, and then we're going to do exactly the same thing on the outer. my bolt's going that way, so I'm going to push the bolt that way on this one, just so that they're not all pointing the same way. And then what you're going to do is just clip these together. Now again, I don't think the instructions do it like this, but we haven't left a hole in our lining, and I honestly don't think it makes a difference. If you want to do it the way it does it in the instructions, you can pull these back through the opening that you left, sew the sleeves together and then turn it, but I just find it easier to do it like this. Plus you don't end up creating an endless loop of sleeve and garment, and then when you pull it, it just, you never find the end of it, and it just keeps coming, and you can never turn it right side out. It's a little bit fiddly, I have to say, especially as my French Terrier is stretchy and my softshell is not stretchy. We'll keep pushing and bending and getting it sorted. Right. Okay, I'm just going to do this approximately to show you. I won't actually sew it. Now once you've done this and you've sewn around this sleeve end, and just top stitch it in exactly the same way again. It looks lovely if all your top stitching on all the edges is exactly the same. So use the same top stitching width, or use a decorative stitch, or you know, whatever you fancy really. And all you're going to do is literally sew around that end piece, and that will finish your sleeves off. Do it on both sleeves, all the way around the edge, and you are done for sewing it together. Now I've made this coat so that I can put poppers on it. I'm going to put poppers through all my layers. So let's pretend this front edge is nicely finished, and I've done all my top stitching. It looks beautiful. I have this rather nifty little tool which I found on Amazon, because I cannot do things evenly to save my life. So it is very cool. I love it. Decide where you want your first one to be. Make sure your space at the bottom is the same at the top, and then just do this. Make sure it's straight, and then just mark each point. If you want more, less buttons, just move that up a little bit. So decide how many poppers you want along the front. I'm probably going to do, I think maybe 5. An odd number's always good. I don't know why, it just looks nicer. And then you just draw the points with a biro or something. I'll use a biro because you're going to put poppers over them anyway, so it doesn't matter if you mark the fabric. And then you're going to line this up like that. You're going to make sure that your overlap at the top and bottom is exactly the same width, like that. You're going to find the first little biro mark that you've made, and you're going to get a poker. I don't know what this official name is, I call it the pokey stick. And just shove it through all the layers. Don't get your hands in the way. Once you've pushed it through all the layers, you'll have a front and a back that line up. This means when you put your popper in, when you close it, it'll line up. So I'll do, once I've sewn around all this, I'll do a quick sew along just to do the buttons on the front and show you how to put the poppers in, because it's getting close to 9 and I know it's getting quite late for everyone. So I'll do another tutorial on just adding the poppers, and I'll also video me doing some of the top stitching for the front piece so you can have an idea of how I do it. But once you've done that top stitching and you put those poppers on, you're going to have the cutest little coat. And I mean, who's going to lose their little one in something like that? There you go. So I haven't included the additional little hanging loop which you can sew into the lining here, and this is the most basic version of the Woodland Wanderer. It has no pockets, but I mean, how cute is that? So I'm going to finish this up and get it gifted to my friend. I'll make little videos as I go along, but I hope you all enjoyed the sew along, and hopefully I'll be doing another one soon. But suggestions on a postcard please, because I can't think of what to sew. So if you have any suggestions or you want to know anything, let me know. And I hope you all enjoyed it. Have a lovely evening, and I will see you all later. Bye!